My name is Marc-Andre Pigeon. I'm the director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives. Before we begin today's conversation, I want to acknowledge that we're coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, and this is the traditional land of the Cree, the Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the Métis. From them, I think we can learn to be grateful for this land, the water, and the skies that make this event and all that we do possible. We can also learn from them the importance of recognizing our shared responsibility over these resources and how we have to work together to make sure they're still there for our children and grandchildren. Now, before we begin today's conversation with Bill Oemichen, a word on our Brown Bag series. This Brown Bag series is structured around a conversation with an invited guest, but it's at least as much about creating space for informal conversations as it is about that conversation with our guest. These informal conversations are the tissues that kind of stitch us together. And so that's why we structured the process to allow for some of that informal conversation to happen. So the way things are going to work today is Bill's going to do a maybe 15 or so minute presentation. Bill and I will have an exchange for 5-10 minutes. Then we're going to go to breakouts, and then we'll regroup as a plenary, and then we'll close. So that's the process. Now let me tell you a bit about Bill. Bill is a PhD student at the University of Saskatchewan, and his research is focused on the potential national security implications of increasing foreign ownership of agriculture infrastructure. Bill is also a fellow at the Canadian Centre for Study of Co-operatives, who's hosting this event, and a food system security researcher at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now, Bill's resume is very long, and I won't go through all of it, but I'll hit some highlights because they are, I think, relevant to the talk today. Bill has served as president and CEO of Cooperative Network, which is the leading statewide cooperative council representing more than 600 Minnesota and Wisconsin, so 2 states, cooperative businesses. He was a deputy Minnesota Agriculture Commissioner and Wisconsin Trade and Consumer Protection Administrator. So he's worked in government, cooperative sector, private legal services. He's been around. So Bill also serves on several cooperative boards of directors, including the education and insurance arm of the Farm Credit, the American Farm Credit System, which is a $365 billion entity that's owned by 500,000 farmers and ranchers in the United States. Bill has a Juris Doctorate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School, a BA in economics from Carleton University, and was a public policy fellow at the University of Minnesota. And as I mentioned earlier, is a PhD student at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. So, Bill, over to you to share some of your thoughts on big data and agriculture.
Well, thank you, Professor Pigeon. I'll have to do one correction because Marc-Andre went to Carleton University. I went to Carleton College, which is in Northfield, Minnesota. So just to make that clear, we both wear sweatshirts that say Carleton on them, but they're different colors. But anyway, it's great to be with all of you today. For those of you who are Star Wars fans, may the 4th be with you. And I don't know, that might pick up a few of you here, but very happy to have this opportunity to talk about ag data. And it will go right away to slides. And my colleague Stan from the Center for Co-ops will be running the slides. So now it's right in front of you. And we'll go to the first slide. So the University of Saskatchewan, Johnson Shoyama Graduate School, Public Policy, we received 2 different grants from the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, SSHRC as it's called. One was a knowledge synthesis grant, and that you'll see one of the work products, the title page on the right side of your screen. But we did a study. We looked at where things are currently at basically in ag data, particularly in Canada, but we also looked around the world. And some of that research I'll be making pretty apparent as I go through the presentation today. Then as a follow-up to that research, we received a Connections grant. And the Connections grant is really intended to bring potential stakeholders or actual stakeholders together and to discuss the challenges of ag data and aggregation. And we had a conference at Thompson Rivers University back at the end of March. And it was a couple of day conference, a symposium, and then a workshop. And I'll be talking a little bit about the outcome of that as well. Going to the next slide. There's 4 of us from the University of Saskatchewan who participated in the research, and Murray Fulton, who many of you know, who is a professor and a fellow at the center. And then, of course, everyone knows Marc-Andre because he's online with us at the moment. And then Assistant Professor Yang Yang participated in the research, and then I participated as a slightly older than normal PhD candidate at the University of Saskatchewan. And I have to point out Stan, who's running the slides. He's been instrumental in all of this as well. Going on to the next slide. So in the last 10 years, there's been a dramatic transition from analog devices in agricultural equipment to digitized devices. And which I'll talk about in a moment, talking about the Internet of Things and smart devices. Smart devices have been incorporated in many aspects of agriculture. Again, this has really occurred over the last 10 years, but every year the tempo continues to pick up. And so we see smart devices in farm implements, including tractors, planters, crop sprayers, and combines, robotic milkers, for those like me who tend to be pretty close to the dairy industry. Instead of using labor, you can actually have milkers that milk the cows. And that there's smart devices in that equipment that measures whether or not the cow has been there before, how much the cow ration has been consumed by that cow, and so on. Cattle ear tags, both in the dairy and broader livestock industry, and then in processed agricultural and food products. And there's a variety of data that's being collected. And as you can see on the right side, weather and climate information is combined, land use data is combined, animal and animal production, crop and crop production, soils and weed conditions to combine with what's actually being planted, what's being seeded, or when you have herbicides or pesticides being applied, where's the location that those should be applied because there are weeds in one particular location and not in another. And then harvesting, what kind of harvesting are we getting from our crop field, depending on where we are in that field. And of course, in Saskatchewan and in the prairie provinces, many of the farms are quite extensive, where you're talking 5 or more thousands of acres. And so this information is very, very valuable information. And what it's really meant is to put the right product in the right place at the right time to get the maximum amount of yield. Going on to the next slide. There's a number of companies that are creating what's known as big data. And big data is not just in agriculture, but it's in many other areas as well. And you can see some of the names that are actively involved in ag data. These are some of the top. So whether it's John Deere and their headquarters for their finance arms, only about 1 kilometer away from where I'm currently sitting in Madison, Wisconsin. Bayer, for example, after their purchase of Monsanto out of St. Louis, Missouri, back about 6-7 years ago, they became the largest holder of agricultural data in the world. And it's thought by some that they hold about 53% of the ag data. And then you have some relatively newer entrants like the Farmers Business Network, that are getting involved in gathering this data so that they can provide products and services to their member customers. They're not a cooperative, but to their member customers at a lower price and hopefully a more efficacious way from their perspective than what they could get from their more traditional seed, pesticide, or herbicide dealer. And so all this data is being collected, as I said, through smart devices. And then artificial intelligence and machine learning is being applied, along with predictive analytical algorithms. And so what's not really being created by the aggregators is a whole new set of data, but it's really a set of predictions. And people are interested in buying these predictions so that they can make determinations on what, for example, some of this agricultural data is being sold to hedge funds. And the hedge funds are using this information then to determine what's the most productive farmland we could potentially buy to the extent that we're investing in agricultural farmland. And we can talk more about this later when we get into questions. I've limited myself to about a minute per slide, so I will just keep on moving. Next slide, please. And you see in the slide a picture of a drone. And drones have become quite popular, not just in Ukraine as they're fighting Russia. And I happen to have a first-generation Ukrainian wife. who's very interested in what's going on over there. But drones are very, very important to agriculture. And so they can go over a field and look at what kind of weeds are occurring in that field, where there's a proper use of pesticide and herbicides. So one of the real opportunities with this is to reduce the use of pesticides and herbicides and fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer. And this represents a significant environmental gain, but also particularly at this time, a monetary gain for the farmer versus what they would have experienced before, particularly as we're in a time right now, really, really high crop input prices. And the net result is farmers who are using smart devices are generally seeing an increase in farmland yields and return per acre. And so there's a definite positive economic impact from the digitization of agriculture. Next slide. But there are some issues that come up that balance to some degree some of the benefits of the digitization of agriculture. And privacy being one of them. As this data is being collected, how are the companies who are collecting this data ensuring the privacy and security of that data so that farmers don't feel like, or agricultural producers, ranchers, don't feel like information that's very, very proprietary to them is being released to others in an improper manner. Data ownership as well. And we can talk about this in a little bit, but there's a real question of who owns the data. When a farmer is generating that data, I don't think there's a question as the farmer owns that data, but once that data is provided to a third party through the smart devices, who owns that data and who owns the aggregation of that data? Data portability. Farmers typically, when they're working with the pesticide dealer or manufacturer, they're downloading software into their farm implements or onto their iPhone, for example. And one of the concerns that farmers have is, if I switch providers of agricultural chemicals, do I lose all that historical data on my farm? Or do I have the ability to keep it? And of course, to the extent they're afraid they're going to lose it, raises competitive issues, because farmers are then going to be more reluctant. And we've interviewed a number of farmers across the prairie provinces in particular, who are reluctant to change suppliers because they don't know what will happen with their data that was previously generated. Market power, again, we talked about Bayer, or I talked about Bayer earlier. 53% of the world's agricultural data. That's a huge trove of information. And the value of that data is really, I think, demonstrated by the chief information officer of Monsanto just prior to the purchase of Monsanto by Bayer. And many think Bayer purchased Monsanto because of the ag data. But that chief information officer said, we manufacture a lot of agricultural products, but the real value is our data. It's not the products, it's not the seed, the ag chem that we're producing. And then there's an issue of lack of farmer trust. And if we go to the next slide, I've got a couple statistics that I think help demonstrate this concern about farmer trust. And back in 2019, so just pre-COVID, Farm Credit Canada did a survey of producers across the country and found that 65 to 70%, as the slide notes, find that information technology has been beneficial to their farming operation. But nearly 25% were less comfortable sharing data because they didn't know all the particular or all the potential implications of the sharing of that data. The American Farm Bureau Federation, which is our largest in the United States, largest farm-oriented association, found 77% of farmers expressed concerns with entities accessing their data, and particularly without their knowledge. But what farmers reported to us in our surveys is they get these lengthy agreements from their input providers, again, pesticides, herbicides, seed. They don't typically read them. And so they don't know what they're agreeing to. And as a result, they have a somewhat of a lack of trust. And I've read a number of those agreements. And I spent 6 years, as Marc-Andre noted at the beginning, as the head of consumer protection for the state of Wisconsin. So part of my job and my 200 staff was to review contracts to determine fairness. And I will say that the contracts I've reviewed that farmers provided me are as difficult to understand as some of those that I've reviewed from telecommunications providers in the United States, just hard to understand. And so the default position is people just agree to them and they don't really read them or understand them. Australia also did a survey. I won't read the statistics there, but you can see pretty large numbers that farmers had little or no trust that the data would be kept private. And we're concerned that data might be shared without their permission. Next slide. And so particularly from a farmer perspective, but there's been a response, particularly in the United States, New Zealand, Australia, the European Union, in response to farmer concerns about all of this data that's being collected. And so there's new programs, voluntary programs with no regulatory provisions, I'll point out. So no government regulatory responsibility. In the United States in 2014, the Farm Bureau took a lead in that. There's a New Zealand Farm Data Code of Practice that was developed at the same time in 2014 that was then adopted and expanded upon by the Australians in 2020. You have the European Union. They have a lot of different regulations related to privacy, but they also have a code of conduct on ag data sharing. And finally, we have the legislation in Canada, the Canadian Digital Charter Implementation Act, which was introduced in Parliament, but was never adopted, in part because the writ was dropped, the Prime Minister, there was a new election, and there's thoughts that this legislation will be reintroduced, and maybe Marc-Andre has more of an update on that, but I couldn't find a whole lot of evidence of legislation being introduced that was patterned off of what had been introduced in the 2020 session of Parliament carrying into 2021. Going on to the next slide, these ag data acts, charters in these other countries really focus on a variety of core principles. You can see the core principles that are noted there, but again, these are voluntary. And so to the extent that industry signs onto them, there's no regulatory enforcement, there's no private enforcement of these, but the whole thrust is to make the agreement between the producer and those acquiring the data more transparent, and to give some boundaries, some sideboards, if I can use that agricultural term, thinking of sideboards on a pickup truck, to put some sideboards to that relationship between the agricultural producer and their crop input supplier. And you can see again some of the provisions that are included in those voluntary principles. Going on to the next slide. So there's policy considerations here in Canada, and a couple of these are cited, or at least 5 of these are cited. Data portability, that's that issue I talked about before. If farmers switch ag input suppliers, will their data transfer over to the next supplier? And so will they have that historical data? Because that's where a lot of the value of that data comes from. Then there's interoperability, and that speaks to more the platform that those who are collecting the ag data, whether or not their platforms can actually speak to each other. So if I'm using a Bayer platform for ag data, and then I'm using somebody else for a different crop input, can I use the data from both of those? Is there a common architecture there that allows me to be interoperable with the ag data that I collected as a producer? I already talked about the Digital Charter Implementation Act, easy for me to say when I'm talking kind of fast here, my apologies. Property rights. Property rights, there's a real question about who owns this data, as I mentioned before, and typically that's tied to the concept of who has property rights. And in the case of aggregated ag data, the question is who has property rights, and are property rights really even a consideration? And so that leads us to the last policy consideration is, as all these privately owned or publicly held companies are collecting this data, does there need to be a response by agricultural producers to form their own data cooperative or some other type of entity so that they can get the benefit of this data as well? And we'll get back to that in just a moment. Going to the next slide. And so I already mentioned, who really owns agricultural data as part of the cooperative response? And as many of you who work in agriculture already know, the ag producers receive little or no compensation for the data they're providing to aggregators. What they're typically getting is the free, quote unquote, free use of software that will collect this historical data from smart devices, and then they can use that, analyze it themselves, and use that to make decisions on their farming operations. or their ag input supplier will make some conclusions based off of this data and make recommendations to them. I will note that many farmers don't exactly trust these recommendations based on our interviews. And then moving to the second bullet, property rights laws are relatively weak in this case, and they provide little benefit to agricultural producers, because when you think about property rights, they're often given to someone who actually holds title to real property. And while ag data in some sense is real property, again, the real value is in the aggregated ag data, not necessarily in the raw data itself. And so the real value is in the predictive analytics. And the farmers don't have ownership of that. It's the large companies, many of which I've already indicated in a previous slide, have the ownership of that aggregated data, not the farmers. So the playing field in some respect is being tilted. And we have what's known as legal coding. And that's when you have a new industry, and this is going on very, very actively in the cryptocurrency industry right now, payday lending industry, other industries, where they create legislation, and legislation puts in place laws that create a legal framework for that industry. And we're starting to see aspects of that by some of the larger companies to put in a legal framework for agricultural data, aggregated ag data. And in many cases, that legal coding is not done at the benefit of the data producer, but those who are owning the data and then aggregating that data. And so you have a scale mismatch, because you have hundreds of thousands of farmers, each having ownership and possession of their own data, but they're up against these very large companies like Bayer who are aggregating the data, and the farmers have to, in many cases, buy that data from the agricultural producer. Next slide, or not from the agricultural aggregator. So insert cooperative response. And Catherine Pistor is a professor at Columbia Law School. She spent some time analyzing this. And one of her main conclusions is data producers themselves wish to have a say in big ag data going forward. They need to create a collective governance structure. Moving on to the next slide. And so there's a partial response in collective cooperative mechanisms. And at our conference, our symposium in Kamloops, and in the workshop the next day, we talked about this. And one of the participants was from a farmer-owned ag data cooperative in Texas, a gentleman by the name of Billy Tiller, the CEO. And it's called Growers Information Service Cooperative, or GISC. And he said he found it really difficult to create a cooperative that was just accumulating a lot of ag data with the idea of competing with the Bayers of the world. But where he found value is in individual projects. And this happens to be one of the projects in the Platte River of Nebraska. They're gathering information from farmers on their water usage. And they're using that to make decisions about the most efficient ways to use water. And they're working with the regulators of water to, in some cases, ameliorate those water regulations so that the regulations that are put in place by the state of Nebraska don't unduly hamper agriculture. So Billy Tiller said he found a really positive application of farmers banding together with their ag data and then using it for this purpose. But again, he found some difficulty doing it in a much broader area with the idea of competing with some of the larger companies like, again, Bayer. Going to the next slide. So where do we go from here? As I said, we had the symposium and the conference in Kamloops, and we're analyzing all the results of that. We had stakeholders from across Canada that participated. And so we'll do continued research, writing presentations, and stakeholder outreach. But part of the purpose of the brown bag today is get some of your thoughts as well. And with that, I think that is the end of my presentation, other than just an ID slide if you want to contact me after this. So thanks very much for the opportunity to present. Be happy to have conversation with Mark, Andre, and then questions from all of you.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was great and right on time. So Bill, before we turn to the breakout conversation, I do have a few questions for you, and just to kind of ease us into that breakout. You know, one thing that struck me, Bill, and I had some prepared questions, but I'm going to go with one that occurred to me as you were talking, which is, I've heard in your presentation, and we've talked about this a few times, farmers have these pain points, right? One is around, they're worried about market power, somebody else having market power over them. They're worried about privacy. Some of the things we heard in events. They're worried about losing the benefits of aggregation, right? They don't get to see any return from the aggregation benefits. And they're also, and I don't know if this is true, but I would guess they're also concerned about their information being used by external entities to pick them off, like the hedge funds, right? So
Right.
what do you think? What do you think's going on? Which of these is the kind of the driver, or is there something even before that? Is there some larger emotion or feeling that's sitting behind all those fears? What do you think's going on there?
Yeah, well, there's a variety of things, as you just pointed out, that are going on there. And as someone who actually farms myself, I think a lot of it is just not really understanding what data is being collected and how that data is being used by others. And the farmers can see the data for themselves, although I pointed out that one of the concerns they have is the recommendations being made by crop input suppliers is not always accurate. And I got to do a big caveat here, particularly because Vern's on here, is that the research really shows that there's only one entity that farmers really trust, and that's their local farm supply cooperative. And that whether that's in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, the interviews that not only that we did, but that have been done by other interviewers around the globe, they really trust their local cooperative. And so really, I think what it comes down to, Marc-Andre, is really just that question of trust.
Right.
And that they have an entity that they work with regularly, their co-op, because they own it, they can run for the board of directors, they can set policy. There's a real trust relationship there, but there isn't necessarily the same kind of trust relationship with their non-cooperative crop input provider. And so that leaves a question mark in their mind, somewhat in my mind, because again, I read these agreements and I just go, I'm a lawyer who reviews these contracts and I'm having trouble understanding all the language there. But I think it really just comes down to there's not a trusting relationship established there. So all these other aspects flow from that.
And then that seems to be, it's ultimately a sense of control, right? That trust is hinging on the absence of control, or the absence of trust is hinging on the
exactly. Yeah, they just feel like they don't have control over the situation. Because when I interviewed a number of producers, particularly in Saskatchewan, said, well, we got this really lengthy agreement, or it came on our iPhone and it was multiple pages, and we just pressed agree or consent, whatever the button said on there. And they said we didn't read it because we knew we weren't going to understand it anyway.
Right. So Bill, I have one more question. This is I should have probably seated with you beforehand, but I'm going to try it anyway. So you and I and Murray and Yang, we've been around this bush for a while, and I'm wondering what through this process, what has surprised you, or what did you learn along the way that you maybe didn't know at the beginning? Like how's your sense of this grown over time? What's that aha moment, if you've had one along the way?
It's a continuing aha moment. And that's just the amount of data that's being collected, and in so many, many different ways. And as you know, I have a particular interest about foreign ownership of agricultural data and what that could mean. But when you're thinking there's smart devices in agricultural product processing, so if you think about your fruits and vegetables going off to the retail grocery market, there's smart devices inputted in the containers or the cartons that are monitoring the temperature, the amount of time. And a couple of years ago, that didn't happen. And so now all the way along the process, there's smart devices measuring different types of information to, again, bottom line, to help improve the efficacy of the product, whether it's an ag input, or the quality of the product if it's actually processed agricultural products. But it's just the amount of data that's being collected. And I sit on the education information arm of the American Farm Credit System, and we've got more data than what some people even believe the US Department of Agriculture has, but we've only analyzed just a small bit of that data. And we're trying to figure out what's all there, what could benefit us as we work with our farmer members. But it's just the incredible amount of data. And of course, we're not that far from autonomous farm equipment, where we're not even going to need to have someone sitting on that tractor. The tractor will just go out in the field on its own and figure out exactly the right place to put that seed or apply that agricultural chemical. So I think the aha moment is just the speed of innovation that's occurring in agriculture as well. Right. And it just keeps picking up.
Right. And policymakers kind of trailing behind, and everyone just kind of trying to figure out what this all means, right, at some larger level.
Yeah, I can tell you as a former 12-year regulator at both the federal and the state level, the regulations nowhere are close to keeping up with all of this dramatic change in agriculture.
Okay, great. So thanks, Bill. We're going to now break away to our breakout conversation. This is where we get to hear from you, because this, again, just to remind everyone, these brown bags are to hear from people like Bill, great knowledge and really interesting research, but also to use that as a springboard to kind of socialize a bit and get folks to talk to each other. So when we break you out, I'd ask you to think about sharing, who you are, where you're from, and what kind of work you do. Just kind of, if you don't know the people that are in your breakout group, share those things. If you do know everyone, or even if you get through those questions within the allotted time, then we would like you to think about a question that Bill has left us with, and has sought some feedback from the audience around. And that is, and Stan's going to post this in our chat, what role or roles could a farmer-owned agricultural data cooperative play in creating greater balance between the producers of agricultural data and the companies that aggregate and ultimately monetize the data? So that kind of where's the space for cooperative data firms in all of this? I might add too, what are the conditions for one of these things to actually emerge? If you have some thoughts about what kind of, what are the dynamics we need to see here in Saskatchewan or in Western Canada or anywhere in Canada for that matter, for a farmer-owned data cooperative to come into being. So let's leave that as our question. Stan, can you break us out, please? And Bill and I and Stan will be all joining other groups as well. Okay, so now we've all had a chance to have kind of more informal conversations. If people have questions for Bill, this is your opportunity to ask a question of Bill. Otherwise, I might ask groups to just share a little bit of their conversation. But let's start with that open call. Any questions for Bill that maybe flowed out of your conversation or from his presentation earlier on? And you can just raise your hand with the raise hand function, put it in chat, or maybe just unmute and let us know. I see Eric, you have your hand up. Go ahead, Eric.
Sure, thanks. And pardon the light. I'm isolating in my room. I'm battling COVID right now. So, question I had, one thing you mentioned was, like farmers may perceive there to be the switching costs and working with different suppliers, and if they switch, they may lose some of the data that has been generated over a number of years. And sometimes that data may not be interoperable, right? You talked about the interoperability between going from one platform to another. And I was wondering, when you talked about that, one thing that came to mind in terms of, the other idea in terms of property rights was this idea of the right to repair legislation that has just came through in terms of, with phones or tractors or what have you. And I wonder if within this framework, there'd be a right to download, to make sure that farmers or users could download their data in a common format that they can, it could work with if they want to be a member of a data co-op, it could work with a data co-op. If they go from supplier A to supplier B, that data is not lost. So I wonder if that might be, in terms of the policy framework, that might be a place to start. And then you can have all these different ideas kind of sprout up from that if you know that you have more data to work with. I'd just like to hear if I'm way out in the left field on that, or if you think that might be something where a policy thing could work. And I'll hang up and listen.
Okay, well, thanks, Eric, for that question. I hope you feel better here very soon. But thanks for participating despite having COVID. But yes, we've talked about that quite a bit at the University of Saskatchewan, and that came up during the symposium and the workshop as well. Is there a response that's really needs to focus on the data portability and the interoperability so that farmers, again, don't face that challenge that if they switch suppliers, that they've lost all the value in the data that they've created to that date, and can continue to have that data readily available for historical purposes and building trend lines and things of that nature. The challenge that I think we see is that there's not a lot of interest within the industries to ensure that that's going to happen, whether implicitly or explicitly. They look at trying to build market share and retain that market share. And so there's not really an incentive for that, for them to do that. And so that then suggests, so if farmers push back on that, who's going to be the one that can help ensure that that actually happens? And that may be more of a governmental regulatory response. And that is if the government's even listening. And that's why we put up the legislation from the last 2 years in Parliament, whether or not that is not necessarily a vehicle, but is that part of a framework for having this discussion? And I know as we've been doing our research, Marc-Andre in particular has been talking a lot to various Canadian government officials, and those are some of the issues that are being brought up, because in many cases, government doesn't even know this is a problem. And so it's informing government that there is a problem, and then trying to determine, well, if it is a problem, who can best provide a response to that, whether it's governmental or private sector. Again, and I'll stop here in about 10 seconds, but when you look at the efforts in New Zealand and Australia, the United States and European Union, the effort there has really been focused on voluntary programs by manufacturers and ag input suppliers. But again, it's voluntary. And so is there an incentive built in for them to do the right thing? Not necessarily.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, because I think in principle, policymakers could make that playing field scenario you outlined possible, Eric. The challenge is, are they, like Bill said, are they aware? Are they motivated? And they're being counter lobbied by big firms who want to create walled gardens, who want to trap them. So that part of this challenge is not just building a co-op for farmers in the immediate sense, it's building an awareness and a lobbying capacity, because that's where a lot of this stuff will get settled out. Bill's work in this area is really important from that perspective. I did say in our breakout group, Bill, one of the areas where you see something like this happening, and Vern brought this up, is in banking, where in Canada there will be legislative power for consumers to get their data. If I'm at Royal Bank and I want to pull my data and send it to Credit Union X, I will be able to do that, and Royal Bank can't say boo. They can't say no. So could something like that be extended to data for farmers, agriculturists? Possibly, but again, it's a lobbying issue. At some level, it's going to be that lobbying issue. And one thing that did come out of our symposium, I mentioned this, Bill, in our little breakout, is we did have folks from industry, science, and economic development who have that responsibility for that legislation. They have created a small team of people who are exploring the data, the ag data side of the data charter issue. So maybe something will happen, but we'll see.
Yeah, because the legislation that was before Parliament really focused around consent and whether or not consumers or customers consented to their data being collected and aggregated. And there's a lot of question about how effective consent provisions really even are these days. And so is that where the focus should be, or it should be on something that's more deep, which would more, I hate to use the word mandate because that's a bad word with a lot of folks, but whether or not there should be some nudges to industry to do the right thing to allow for portability and interoperability.
So Vern has his hand up. We'll go to that just really quickly, Vern. The other thing about the federal legislation is it's consumer oriented, not business producer oriented. So it's it's meant from more that perspective rather than the corporate person perspective. So that's important. Australia, interestingly, has gone the other way. They've extended their data charter provisions to corporate persons as well. So Vern, over to you.
Yeah, great, thanks. No, that's an interesting topic, and it's one that I know that on the banking side, they've basically said that the consumer owns their data, and that's what drives all of the interoperability and permissions and consent around that. But then turning to another question I had, Bill, in all of your research to date, are you aware of any large organization who's out there collecting ag data like Bayer, any programs that they have in terms of sharing, a profit sharing model with the monetization of that data to those who provide the data initially? So in other words, is there a benefit structure that the producer might get from participating in that data share?
So really good question, Vern, which I'd expect from you. I have not found one where there's a sharing of the monetization that's occurred of that data. Rather, what those crop input suppliers would say is we're sharing analytics with you, the farmer, on where best to apply that ag chem on which specific field on your farm. But that's the extent of it. I have not seen where there's been any sharing of any kind of monetary value. And that's why I think the cooperative model is pretty unique in this case, because for FCL and others, to the extent that you're doing this, to the extent you're generating positive net margin from that, you're sharing it back with your member owners in a way that Dow is sharing it with their stockholders, but they're not sharing it with their producers who are buying their agricultural chemicals and seed from Bayer. And so it's a different model. And again, all the research I've done, and maybe Marc-Andre for the research you've done, and Yang was on here earlier, but I've not seen a model where the aggregator is sharing the monetary value back to the farmers who gave them that information. Basically what they're saying, we'll give you access to your own data for free, or in some cases for $25, but that's the extent of the benefit that they're providing.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Good to know.
I think, well, great question, Vern, and good answer, Bill. I haven't seen anything either. Look, folks, we're at what time? I just want to thank everyone for being here. Special thanks to Bill for the presentation. It was excellent. I hope you found this engaging and useful. And watch our website. We're going to be, as Bill said, we're going to be writing and doing more in this space as we go forward. But I also want to remind folks before they go that we have these brown bag talks every month, the first Wednesday of every month. And our next speaker is going to be Bina Agarwal, who's a woman economist out of the UK, who specializes in studying producers again, but collective action amongst producers. So actually quite related to today's topic. And I hope you will join us. That's May 1st. That's the Wednesday, same time, same place. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.